What if everything you thought you knew about Greek mythology was backwards? Not fantasy that inspired history, but history that created the fantasy. For over 2,000 years, scholars dismissed these ancient stories as pure fiction. Gods, monsters, and heroes fighting impossible battles in imaginary places. Then archaeologists started digging, and what they found changed everything. These weren't just bedtime stories the Greeks told their children. They were memories, distorted, exaggerated, wrapped in divine explanation, but memories nonetheless. Real cities, actual catastrophes, genuine phenomena the ancient world witnessed but couldn't scientifically explain. So they did what humans always do when faced with the inexplicable. They created narratives that made sense within their understanding of reality. The line between myth and history isn't as clear as you've been taught. Troy stood for centuries as mythology's most famous example. Homer's Iliad described it in vivid detail. The towering walls, the wooden horse, the 10-year siege. Scholars nodded politely and filed it under fiction. A poet's imagination, nothing more. Then in 1870, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann did something audacious. He took Homer literally. Schliemann wasn't an archaeologist. He was a merchant who'd made a fortune and decided to spend it chasing a legend. Most academics thought he was wasting his time and money. They were wrong. At a site called Hisarlik in modern Turkey, Schliemann's excavation team started finding walls, then gates, then evidence of massive fire destruction, then layer after layer of ancient settlements stacked on top of each other like geological pages in a history book. The site contained 9 distinct cities built one atop the ruins of the last, spanning 4,000 years of continuous habitation. Troy wasn't mythology. It was real estate, repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt in the same strategic location overlooking the Dardanelles Strait. Schliemann's methods were catastrophic. He used dynamite. He destroyed irreplaceable evidence in his rush to reach what he assumed was Homer's Troy. He blasted through Troy 6 and 7, the layers that actually corresponded to the late Bronze Age when the Trojan War would have occurred, because he was convinced the oldest layer must be the correct one. But despite his archaeological brutality, Schliemann proved something profound. The Greeks weren't making it up. They were remembering something that actually happened, preserved through oral tradition for centuries before Homer ever put stylus to wax tablet. The war might have been embellished. Gods probably didn't walk the battlefield. But the city was real, the conflict was real, and the memory survived. Here's what makes this unsettling. If Troy was real, what else was real? In 1900, British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating on Crete. He uncovered a massive palace complex at Knossos, sprawling across acres with over 1,300 rooms connected by corridors that twisted and doubled back on themselves in bewildering patterns. Evans stood in those ancient hallways and recognized something. He was standing inside the Labyrinth. The myth told of King Minos, who commissioned the master craftsman Daedalus to build an inescapable maze beneath his palace. At its center lived the Minotaur, a creature half man and half bull, born from Queen Pasiphae's unnatural union with a sacred bull. Every 9 years, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women as tribute. They were released into the Labyrinth, where the Minotaur hunted them through the darkness until the hero Theseus finally killed the beast. Pure mythology, right? Except Evans kept finding bulls. Bull imagery covered the walls. Massive bull horns carved from stone flanked ceremonial areas. Frescoes depicted young athletes leaping over charging bulls in what appeared to be ritual performances. The palace itself, with its maze-like layout, matched descriptions of the legendary labyrinth almost perfectly. There's even evidence the word labyrinth derives from labris, the double-headed axe that appears repeatedly in Mington iconography, carved into the palace walls themselves. Was there actually a monster? Probably not. But there was definitely a palace that felt like a maze to visitors. There was absolutely a culture obsessed with bull worship and bull leaping rituals. and there were likely tribute arrangements between Minoan Crete and mainland Greece, formalized through treaties that might have included sending youth for training or service. Over centuries of retelling, these elements merged and transformed. The palace became an impossible maze. The tribute became human sacrifice. The sacred bulls and their dangerous rituals became a single monster lurking in the darkness. The myth wasn't invented, it was history filtered through the distorting lens of oral tradition and religious interpretation. You start seeing this pattern everywhere once you know what to look for. In 373 BCE, a catastrophic earthquake struck the city of Helike on the Gulf of Corinth. Ancient sources describe what happened next in terms that sound apocalyptic. The ground opened, the sea rushed in. The entire city, one of the most powerful in the Achaean League, vanished beneath the waves in a single night. Every inhabitant perished. No survivors, no trace, just churning water, where a thriving metropolis had stood hours before. For over 2,000 years, Helike existed only in ancient texts. Another Greek story, probably exaggerated, possibly fabricated entirely. Then in 2001, archaeologists found it, buried in an ancient lagoon exactly where the sources said it would be. The earthquake had caused the ground to liquefy and collapse. The tsunami that followed had swept over the sunken city. Sediment had gradually filled the lagoon over centuries until it became dry land again, hiding the ruins under fields and farms. The Greeks hadn't exaggerated. They'd accurately described one of history's most dramatic natural disasters. And here's where it gets interesting. Plato wrote about Atlantis around 360 BCE, roughly 13 years after Helike's destruction. His account describes an advanced civilization destroyed in a single day and night when it sank beneath the sea. Sound familiar? Scholars have debated Atlantis' existence for millennia. Most conclude Plato invented it as a philosophical allegory. But what if he wasn't creating fiction? What if he was referencing current events, a catastrophe so dramatic and so recent that everyone listening would have immediately understood the parallel? Helike proved that prosperous cities could vanish overnight, swallowed by forces beyond human control. Plato simply projected that reality backward in time, creating a cautionary tale wrapped in the authentic memory of how quickly civilization can disappear beneath the waves. The Oracle of Delphi presented a different kind of mystery. For over 1,000 years, pilgrims travelled from across the Mediterranean to consult the Pythia, the priestess who delivered prophecies while in an ecstatic trance. Ancient sources consistently described the same phenomenon. The Pythia would descend into the temple's inner chamber, inhale vapours rising from a chasm in the earth, and enter an altered state during which she'd utter cryptic pronouncements that priests would interpret. Modern scholars dismiss this as obvious fabrication. There was no chasm. Geological surveys showed solid bedrock. The vapours were clearly mythological embellishment, added to make the prophecies seem more mystical and divine. Except in 2001, an interdisciplinary team made an unexpected discovery. They found the chasm. Not a dramatic cavern, but a genuine geological fault line running directly beneath the temple ruins. And they found something else. Chemical analysis of spring water and travertine deposits near the temple revealed ethylene gas seeping from the fractured bedrock below. Ethylene, a sweet-smelling hydrocarbon that, when inhaled in small doses, produces exactly the effects ancient sources described: euphoria, a floating sensation, and vivid, altered states of consciousness. The Pythia wasn't faking her trances. She was genuinely intoxicated by geological emissions that modern medicine once used as an anesthetic. The Greeks had accurately documented a real phenomenon, attributing it to Apollo's divine presence because they lack the chemical knowledge to explain it any other way. What makes this discovery remarkable isn't just the vindication of ancient accounts, it's the precision. The Greeks consistently described vapours rising from a specific location beneath the temple. They noted the sweet smell. They documented behavioural changes consistent with ethylene exposure. They built an entire religious institution around a geological reality they couldn't scientifically explain, but could certainly observe and utilize. This brings us to one of mythology's most dramatic figures, the Amazons. Warrior women who supposedly lived on the fringes of the known world, fighting on horseback, using bows with deadly accuracy, and matching any male warrior in combat. Greek art depicted them constantly. Herodotus wrote about them. Plutarch included them in his histories. But for centuries, scholars dismissed them as pure fantasy. Masculine anxiety about female power projected onto distant barbarian tribes that probably didn't exist. Then archaeologists started opening graves around the Black Sea region. About 300 burial sites have been excavated across Ukraine, southern Russia, and the northern shores of the Black Sea, and roughly 1/3 of these warrior graves contain female skeletons. Not priestesses with ceremonial weapons, not symbolic burials, actual women buried with battle-worn armour, horses, quivers full of arrows, iron daggers, spears and battle axes, showing clear signs of use in combat. In recent years, researchers discovered something unprecedented. A single tomb containing 4 generations of warrior women, spanning ages from a 12-year-old girl to a woman in her 50s. The youngest was buried with a complete set of arrows. The oldest had an iron dagger and a unique forked arrowhead. Another woman in the tomb was positioned like a horseman surrounded by weapons and horse gear. This wasn't ceremonial. These women lived as warriors, died as warriors, and were honoured as warriors by their communities. The graves reveal combat injuries, healed bone fractures consistent with mounted archery accidents, weapon trauma showing they'd survived previous battles. One skeleton shows evidence of a partially healed skull fracture, suggesting she'd taken a blow to the head in combat, recovered, and continued fighting. The material culture matches Greek descriptions almost perfectly. These women lived in the exact regions ancient sources identified as Amazon territory. They practiced mounted archery. They fought in battles. They were everything the myths described. What changed wasn't reality. The warrior women existed all along. What changed was our willingness to believe ancient sources might be documenting genuine observations rather than inventing convenient fiction. The Greeks encountered Scythian nomadic cultures where women participated in warfare, and they recorded what they saw. Later cultures, uncomfortable with the concept of female warriors, reinterpreted these accounts as mythology. Archaeology simply confirmed what the Greeks had been saying for millennia, but some myths seem too fantastical for any reality-based explanation. Jason and the Argonauts sailing to distant Colchis to steal a golden fleece guarded by a dragon. Pure adventure fantasy, right? Except geologists in the Republic of Georgia started investigating ancient gold extraction techniques and discovered something unexpected. The Svaneti region, located in what was ancient Colchis, contains extensive gold fields. Mountain streams carry tiny particles of gold eroded from surrounding rock formations. For thousands of years, possibly dating back to when the Jason myth was forming, locals have used a specific technique to extract this gold. They immerse sheepskins in streams. The wool fibers trap the gold particles. After days or weeks, they remove the sheepskin and recover the gold by burning or washing the fleece, a golden fleece, created through a technique so effective it's persisted for millennia. The dragon guarding the fleece? Possibly a metaphor for the dangerous journey required to reach these remote mountain gold fields, or perhaps a misunderstood reference to the serpentine rivers that carried the gold. The myth wasn't invented wholesale. It was an actual voyage, an actual destination, and an actual technique, transformed through retelling into an epic quest narrative. The pattern reveals something profound about how mythology functions. The Greeks weren't creating elaborate fantasies from nothing. They were processing, interpreting, and transmitting information about real phenomena, real places, and real encounters using the narrative and explanatory frameworks available to them. Sometimes this meant attributing geological events to divine punishment. Sometimes it meant transforming trade expeditions into heroic quests. Sometimes it meant describing foreign cultures through the lens of their own cultural assumptions and fears. But underneath the mythological overlay, there's consistently a core of observable reality. Consider the Cyclops, one-eyed giants featured prominently in Greek mythology, most famously in the Odyssey when Odysseus blinds Polyphemus. For centuries, these were considered pure imagination. Then, in 1914, paleontologist Athenio Abel proposed something fascinating. He suggested the Cyclops myth originated from ancient Greeks discovering fossil skulls of Pleistocene dwarf elephants. These skulls, particularly those of Dinotherium giganteum found throughout the Mediterranean, have a massive central nasal cavity where the trunk attached. To modern paleontologists, this cavity's purpose is obvious, but to ancient Greeks who'd never seen a living elephant, that enormous hole in the center of the skull would look exactly like a single massive eye socket. The actual eye sockets are comparatively tiny and easy to miss. Mediterranean islands, including Sicily, the mythological home of Polyphemus, contain abundant fossils of dwarf elephants and other extinct megafauna. The Greeks found these skulls, developed an explanation for what they were looking at based on available information, and incorporated that explanation into their mythology. They weren't inventing monsters. They were interpreting paleontological evidence. This reframes everything. Greek mythology wasn't primitive superstition or pure entertainment. It was their scientific literature, their way of recording and explaining observations about the world using the conceptual tools available to Bronze and Iron Age civilizations. They documented real earthquakes, real cities, real geological phenomena, real foreign cultures, and real paleontological discoveries. They just wrapped these observations in narrative frameworks involving gods, monsters, and heroes, because that's how their culture transmitted and preserved information across generations. What we're really discovering isn't that myths were true. We're discovering that the Greeks were far better observers of physical reality than we gave them credit for. They paid attention. They documented what they saw. They passed those observations forward through the only mass communication system available: oral tradition and mythology. The question isn't whether Greek myths contain truth. The question is how much truth we've been dismissing simply because it arrived wrapped in stories about gods and monsters. How many other myths are we still categorizing as pure fantasy when they're actually encoded observations waiting to be decoded? The implications extend beyond Greek culture entirely. If the Greeks were encoding genuine observations within mythology, what about other ancient civilizations? Egyptian myths describe gods with animal heads. Ridiculous fantasy, except Egyptian priests were the world's foremost experts on anatomy and animal behavior. They mummified millions of animals. They observed wildlife systematically. When they depicted Anubis with a jackal head, were they creating random imagery or encoding observed behavioral connections between jackals and death, scavenging, and burial grounds? Norse mythology describes a world tree, Yggdrasil, connecting 9 realms. Absurd cosmology until you consider that Norse cultures lived among the world's most extensive fungal networks, where single organisms span miles underground, connecting entire forest ecosystems. Modern mycology has revealed that trees communicate through fungal networks, sharing nutrients and information across vast distances. The Norse didn't have electron microscopes, but they lived in those forests. They observed the interconnectedness. They encoded it as Yggdrasil. Hindu epics describe flying vehicles called vimanas, with technical specifications that sound remarkably like aerodynamic design principles. Impossible ancient technology, except similar detailed descriptions exist for architectural engineering, metallurgy, and astronomical calculations that we've confirmed were accurate. If they could precisely describe eclipses and structural engineering, why assume the Vimana descriptions are pure invention rather than observations of something they encountered? The pattern holds across cultures. Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime stories describe the flooding of coastal areas and the formation of islands with such geological precision that researchers have used them to reconstruct sea level changes from 10,000 years ago. Native American legends describe massive floods, volcanic eruptions, and landscape transformations that align perfectly with geological evidence of catastrophic events. Chinese mythology preserves accounts of massive floods and earthquakes that correspond to known geological events. Ancient humans weren't primitive. They were observant. They paid attention to their environment with an intensity modern humans can barely imagine because their survival depended on it. They noticed patterns, documented changes, and transmitted crucial information across generations using the only storage medium available: story. We've been so focused on the fantastical elements that we missed the database underneath. Each pantheon of gods represents a specialized knowledge system. Agricultural deities encode farming techniques and seasonal patterns. Weather gods preserve meteorological observations. Underworld mythology documents geological phenomena, including earthquakes, volcanic activity, and cave systems. Sea gods transmit maritime knowledge about currents, tides, and navigation. The Greeks' use of mythology as their scientific literature becomes even more sophisticated when you examine how they updated it. Myths weren't static. They evolved as new information became available. When Greeks encountered new cultures, animals, or geological phenomena, they integrated those observations into existing mythological frameworks. The mythology was their living, updating database of knowledge about the world. This explains something that's puzzled scholars for centuries. Why are there so many versions of Greek myths with contradictory details? Because different regions were encoding different local observations. Coastal cities had different versions of sea-related myths than inland cities because they observed different maritime phenomena. Northern regions had different monster descriptions than southern regions because they encountered different fossil deposits. The methodology was actually brilliant. By encoding practical information within memorable narratives involving gods and heroes, they ensured transmission across generations even during periods of literacy collapse. You don't need to read to remember a good story. The narrative structure served as a mnemonic device, preserving detailed information that might otherwise be lost. Consider what this means for archaeology. We've been excavating sites looking for physical evidence while ignoring a massive corpus of written testimony that's been staring us in the face for millennia. Greek mythology isn't just entertainment or religious texts. It's their equivalent of scientific journals, geographical surveys, and historical chronicles combined. We've dismissed it as fiction when it's actually data formatted for oral transmission. Modern archaeology has validated this approach repeatedly. Troy wasn't found through random excavation. Schliemann used the Iliad as a guide, treating it as a historical document despite professional archaeologists insisting it was pure fantasy. He was right, they were wrong. The myth preserved enough accurate geographical and historical information to locate a real city. The same pattern appears everywhere researchers have bothered to check. When archaeologists actually test mythological claims against physical evidence, instead of dismissing them as fantasy, they keep finding correlations. The Oracle of Delphi really did involve gaseous emissions. The Labyrinth really did exist as a complex palace structure. Helic really did sink into the sea. Amazons really did exist as warrior women. The Golden Fleece really did represent actual gold extraction techniques. Each validation should make us more willing to examine other myths seriously. Instead, archaeology continues treating mythology as guilty until proven innocent, requiring extensive physical evidence before considering that maybe, just maybe, the ancient people who wrote these stories down were describing something real. The resistance makes sense psychologically. Admitting that ancient mythology contains genuine scientific observation requires acknowledging that pre-modern civilizations were more sophisticated than we assumed. It means recognizing that oral cultures developed effective information storage and transmission systems that functioned remarkably well. It means accepting that we've been needlessly dismissive of entire knowledge systems because they didn't match our expectations for how information should be formatted. But the evidence keeps accumulating. The Greeks documented what they saw. They explained it using available frameworks. They preserved those observations through narrative structures designed for memorability and transmission. That's not primitive superstition. That's sophisticated information management adapted to the technological constraints of Bronze Age civilization. The question facing modern archaeology isn't whether Greek myths contain truth. We've answered that. They do. The question is how systematically we're willing to mine that database for information. How many other myths are we still categorizing as fantasy when they're actually encoded observations waiting for proper interpretation? Every time we validate another mythological claim, we prove the Greeks were better observers than we credited. Every time we discover they accurately documented something we assumed was impossible, we reveal our own assumptions were wrong. The myths aren't primitive. Our interpretation of them has been. What other knowledge is sitting in plain sight within mythological texts, waiting for us to stop assuming ancient people couldn't possibly have observed and documented real phenomena accurately? The Greeks showed us the answer. They watched the world carefully, recorded what they saw precisely, and transmitted those observations forward through the most durable information storage system available: story. The real lesson isn't that myths were true, it's that we've been reading them wrong. These weren't bedtime stories or religious parables. They were Bronze Age scientific papers, encoded in the only format that could survive millennia without libraries or digital storage. The Greeks watched their world with precision we've only recently begun to appreciate. They documented earthquakes, fossils, warrior cultures, and geological phenomena using gods and monsters as their filing system. Every validation proves the same thing. Ancient humans weren't primitive storytellers inventing fantasies. They were careful observers, transmitting data through narrative because that's what worked. The myths aren't changing. Our willingness to listen finally is.